It's an interesting topic, and it's one that has occupied the minds of many. With the US experiencing its biggest year-on-year decline of 32.9% in the last quarter, with gold being the new safe haven, with oil slightly rebounding, where do we go to from here? So the question we're going to explore this morning, for business in particular, is how do we come to terms with this new economy, this new economic reality? Okay, so just bear with me. Just see folk are still being admitted, so that's great. Just going to... Okay, I'm just going to move the slide pack along. Just bear with us. Thank you. It's really great to have you all here. Wonderful, wonderful turnout. Okay, I'm just going to share screen with you. Make sure you can all see that. Natasha, can you see that? If you can just indicate, just wave. Great, thank you. If I could just ask that you may use your video if you're comfortable. Just keep your microphone on mute. And if you could raise your questions throughout in the chat box and enjoy the session. I welcome three of my colleagues with me today, and that is George Rotenbach, who is part of the Alumni Committee, and then Werner Greer, who will be handling some of the thank you notes and the closing. Just my personal profile, just for your awareness. And we move on. I think we will come to understand that in retrospect, we will view the years right before the 2008 financial crisis as the peak of globalization. And I'll explain a little more as we go along. We look to this point in our history as a structural reset. Christelle, can you confirm you can still see the slides? Just making sure. We've had to switch screens. If you can just say yes.
Hi, George. No, we can't see the slides at the moment. Can you reshare, please?
Just bear with us. Sorry, folks, we'll settle the technology as quickly as possible. Okay. Christelle, is that there?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Right. Thank you very much.
Maybe you can just go full screen.
Yeah, for some unknown reason, it doesn't seem to want to move on total screen, so there seems to be a block. But I'm just going to use it on this basis. As long as everybody can see, that's great. Also, just to welcome folk from India, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. It's wonderful to have you all with us this morning as well. So, as we shift our thinking, we begin to ask some questions, some opening thoughts. This is an event that has shaped the globe and society at large, more so than at any other time. And so we begin to raise some questions as to how we will do the following. How will we buy homes? How will we travel? How will we see each other, view each other? How will we interact? What are the levels of surveillance and privacy? And even the language we use. The reality is, as we explored with Prof. Roux some weeks ago, is that the economic landscape has changed. The world has changed. And so how do we adapt to this? Politico Magazine surveyed 30 smart macro thinkers. And today we're going to draw on some of their thinking. They looked at the influencing factors. This virus keeps us in our homes. It's reorienting our relationships to governments. It's reorienting our relationship to the outside world and even to each other. And so some of the questions we ask, will nations remain closed? Will touch become taboo? What about the hospitality industry? What will become of restaurants? And so we attempt to begin to answer these questions. And so over a period of 3 weeks, we explore 21 reasons that the business world has changed forever. Now, crisis presents opportunity. There is definitely the evolution to more sophisticated and flexible use of technology. And something we explored this morning is there is less polarization. And this has been an interesting evolution as a result of this disease, this virus. A revived appreciation of the outdoors. What does that mean for business? What about life's simple pleasures? What about the unknown ways in which society will evolve, react to healthcare and the economy? Our lifestyles and more than that will be changing. So we explore what some of these thinkers are thinking. What are they saying? So the first thinker I'd like to introduce to you is Professor Deborah Tannen of linguistics at Georgetown University in the US. And she explores the following concept. 9/11 brought about a feeling of vulnerability as the events that occurred were only in foreign lands and historically never on home soil, i.e. the United States. The 2008 financial meltdown told us that we could suffer the calamities of past eras. The Great Depression relived. And there are many schools of thought at the moment that in fact we've not really ever recovered from the 2008 financial meltdown. All we've simply done is reset our expectations. The 1918 flu pandemic is a reoccurred sudden specter in our lives. Suddenly, a disease or a virus that occurred 102 years ago in a new mutation has made its way into our world. And so what does that say for us? How do we respond to this? The loss of innocence or complacency is a new way of being in the world. She goes on to explore. We now know that touching people is risky. Breathing in the air in an enclosed space is not a great idea. And extraordinarily, how quickly has that awareness grown? It could become second nature to recoil when shaking hands or touching our faces. Or the simple comfort of being in the presence of others might now be replaced by a greater comfort of absence, especially with those we don't know. Again, what does this say about business? What does this say about the way we're going to interact? Deborah goes on to ask. She says, instead of asking, is there a reason to do this online? We will begin asking, is there any good reason to do this in person? And we might need to be convinced that there is. The paradox of this age will be that online communication will be ratcheted up. It will create more distance, yes, but in equal and greater measure, more connectedness as we communicate more often. People will begin to feel safer in this mode of connectedness. Let me introduce you to a second thinker on this. And this is Professor Mark Lawrence, Shrad. He's a political science lecturer. He goes on to explore and he says, nations have equated patriotism with the armed forces. However, you can't shoot a virus. Those on the front lines against the coronavirus aren't conscripts, mercenaries, or enlisted army officers. They are doctors, nurses, pharmacists, teachers, caregivers, store clerks, utility workers, small business owners, and so the list can go on. Paramedics, etc. So what does this say for business? What does it say for our psyche in the future? When all has been said and done, how will we recognize their sacrifice, the true frontline workers? Will we give them guaranteed health benefits? Business, this is what we need to be thinking about. Will we be thinking about corporate discounts? In the highly controversial world of statues these days, will we build statues to these new frontline workers? Have holidays for this new class of people? When all has been said and done, we too will finally understand a new breed of patriots who've truly laid their lives on the line. Business, what does that say for us? Maybe demilitarization and love of community will be one of the benefits to come out of this awful mess. Thoughts for businesses in this respect are the following: new product lines, new means of creating value-added services, new insurance products, making life easier for those in the front line. Thoughts for governments: when all has been said and done, what kind of nations will we be left with? What is the new narrative? And this is what we explored together. Mark goes on to say, maybe this virus brings about the breaking of cultural, political, escalating depolarization of this age that has been observed developing in many nations. The depolarization is that leftist, centrist, and right thinking. Perhaps we begin to explore a new way forward. Maybe this virus brings about a change in course towards greater nation building and fighting the common enemy. This virus is assisting societies in resetting priorities and bringing about new economic, more socially minded systems. The known economic systems are challenged in their ability to respond meaningfully, and the hard work to rebuild new systems is only the beginning. During the Second World War, the British War Cabinet were amazed at the ascendance of human goodness, altruism, compassion, and generosity of spirit that emerged during the Blitz in London. This ascendance is present again the world over. In other words, a feeling of good-naturedness, a feeling of a common humanity. How do we do this together? How do we forge a new way? What does this mean for business? A development of a new consciousness in keeping with consumers who have changed their patterns and are more planet-minded. What does this mean for fashion houses, brands, luxury goods? The question for business is how to capitalize on the good that is ascendant. Nations and their identities will never be the same again. The world has changed forever, and the patterns of human existence have shown the following. Societal shocks can break in different ways, making things better or worse. Given the current set of local and global shocks, the time is now to begin to promote more constructive patterns in our cultural and political discourse. The reality is the time for change is now. So questions for business. Planning now needs to be in step with a new consumer psyche. Product development now must reflect this changing dynamic. Sales, marketing, communication, brand must be reborn, i.e. here for good. We need to capitalize as businesses on the fact that folk have changed their thoughts, that the virus has brought about a new need pattern. And we need to understand that new need pattern in consumer speak. So I want to introduce you to a final speaker, Professor Tom Nichols of the Naval War College. Nations that have had peace, affluence, and high levels of consumer technology have become complacent. Nations that have a high Gini coefficient are becoming more complacent and inevitably have structural, political, and economic divides. What does all of this mean in the now new, yet to be named, post-COVID economic and political construct? And just a reminder what a Gini coefficient is. In economic speak, the Gini coefficient, sometimes called the Gini index or Gini ratio, is a measure of statistical dispersion intended to represent the income inequality or wealth inequality within a nation or any other group of people. It was developed by the Italian statistician and sociologist Corrado Gini and published in his 1912 paper, Variability and Mutability. So quite simply, the gap between rich and poor. So what does that mean for business? Let's look at the world. The darker colors represent the highest Gini coefficients in the world. The lighter colors, the levels of equality and egalitarian spread of wealth. Look at South Africa, by far one of the darkest colors, meaning our Gini coefficient is one of the worst in the world. In other words, we have the biggest gap between rich and poor. So what does this mean? Complacency in economically established nations exists due to the lack of historical fears. And some of those fears were, will we have enough oil? What about nuclear warfare? What about high unemployment, skyrocketing interest rates, the receding fear of terrorism? Developing nations, complacency arises from the lack of concern for the growing Gini coefficient, which we've just addressed, high unemployment, poor healthcare systems, and political systems that favor the few and not the many. Now in steps this virus. And what now? Where to from here? The following changes, and business now needs to be acutely aware of this. It has forced people back into accepting that expertise matters, that good and serious governments matter, and the need to drive sensible policies and steer nations towards broader, more measured, sustainable prosperity is our new reality. So, what are our reflections? And then we'll move to questions. So our reflections for business: what is prosperity now? What about the words of Frank Bookman? There is enough in the world for everyone's need and not for everyone's greed. Within business, do we begin to ask the question about a new moral rearmament movement for a more planet-minded, stable consciousness? What commercial systems need to be enabled now? What new economic systems need to be developed? What about agility in commercial enterprise? This needs a new definition. Healthcare now has a broader responsibility base, and this is not confined to government and healthcare agencies. The race to find a vaccine is a global effort. A global consciousness has grown. So what does this mean for business? Governments and their elected mandate will change. How will this evolve? Technology advances, new broad-based market thinking. Local markets matter again. And this has been the evolution that we've observed, is that local conditions, local markets are starting to re-emerge. There are green shoots that are starting to say, well, globalization was an interesting development, but actually what marketeers are now briefing into is glocalization. And this is intentional spelling, requires new wings, new means of marketing, new safe broad-based supply chain management. New ways of work for business, new urbanizational principles need to be defined. Urban farming, urban green principles, inexpensive green strategies, new skills in the marketplace, new recruitment practices, new work-life balance principles. So to business in South Africa, these are the questions we need to answer. What of our accumulated wealth is still wealth? Where to for property development companies? Where to for large corporate real estate? What about the social human being? What about food security, global warming, and adaptations for local conditions? So today, we've introduced 7 of 21 adaptations that we would recommend. And here are the 7 talking points that we would ask businesses to consider. Agility. So businesses need to be more agile. The strategic development radar of 100 years, in other words, have 100 years in our sights with the flexibility to evolve in 30 minutes. And those disparate polarized views are intentional. We now need to go and rediscover the consumer. And so the question we ask, what about product development? What is not yet known? What about real estate, new market principles? So corporates in South Africa in particular will be sitting with excess space. What do we do with that space? I interviewed this week somebody who runs the Inner City Partnership for Johannesburg, and they have taken 7 disused buildings and converted them into accommodation and urban farms. Is that not what we should be thinking about? Is that not where we're heading? What about younger workforces paired with expertise? The continent of Africa sits with the youngest workforce in the world. What does that mean in this new world? New wealth is in fact data, big data. So for years, organizations have been talking about big data principles, but that is the new wealth. What about access to data? What about access to communication methods? New wealth we foresee is professional services. It goes back to the comment around expertise. New wealth is local markets with global outreach principles. So I thank you. Dankie, Dhanyavad, Shukran, Nkosi, Kia Leboga. What we're going to do now is I'm going to hand over to George. George, are you online? George Rodenbach. Okay, I think we might have lost George there. I'm going to invite you to ask questions. And initially what we'd suggested is that we open those questions via the chat box. But I'm actually going to suggest Christelle and Lizelle, because we've got quite a wide community here and I can see everyone's screens. Those who'd like to ask a question, please just unmute yourself and feel free to ask questions. So I'm going to put Vern on the spot.
How did I know that was going to happen?
You see from your body language, you just knew it was coming.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I just want to know, like, George, I mean, I know that we've spoken about 7 of these things, and I think that from a South African perspective, what is the thoughts of the audience? Like, how do we think, from a technology point of view, we are geared to ramp up going forward, where technology is ultimately going to be one of the things that is going to drive us into this new era? Are we situated, or are we positioned as a country to actually take that opportunity and run with it? If you're looking at the cost of internet, access to it from a lower income perspective, like what are the kinds of things that people thinking that we can do going forward from that point of view?
Thanks, Verna. It's an interesting one, because when we discuss the Gini coefficient, so the gap between rich and poor, that gap is only going to widen if the access to technology and data and communication methods is not there. And so I do think, and please, I'd be very open to hear what the audience thinks, but I do think there's an opportunity for highly evolved, interactive technology platforms at inexpensive methods of distribution. And so some of the educators we're talking to at the moment, because we happen to be in an education business, is how do you make quality education accessible to the poorest of the poor? And therein lies a business opportunity for South Africa. Christelle's just asking folk also just to post your questions in the chat box, so please do that as well.
Maybe Nirvana has a question for us.
Nirvana always has a question. Nirvana,
yeah, she does.
Can we see you here, Nirvana?
Hi, I was just trying to find the unmute button on my computer. Yes, and I think over the years, the Gini coefficient has always come up in one of our Bryce Weeks when I try to explain to people what it's all about. And I think, we've been on and off the top 3 spots, along with Namibia and Botswana, for quite a while now. And sometimes it's not really about the Gini coefficient itself, but about at what level the politics and the countries are at. Because if you look at the lowest Gini coefficients, you would find them in a country like the Nordic countries like Sweden. They've got probably one of the lowest Gini coefficients in the world. But they have such a developed social system, and they've got quite a limited number of people in the population groups that would actually want to have kids, and they've got one of the lowest birth rates. They could even have a negative birth rate, if I'm incorrect there. So it's got to do with a whole lot of, complex issues. And I think now with COVID, you would actually see with the amount of people that can't actually make it through COVID, it's mostly those that have illnesses and are in I think an age group that's 65 plus. And that's a trend that we've been seeing. And so we say that how does COVID now impact the social systems in countries that have a very low Gini coefficient? And most of those countries coincidentally have an aging population. So I think my question to you, George, is how do we address these kind of issues? Because compared to Western Europe, they have an aging population. We have a very young population, but we have other social illnesses like unemployment and skills gaps, which also makes entrepreneurship such a burning issue and a burning platform right now. So how would you address those?
Yeah, so access to technology is definitely going to be part of the answer. And what we're exploring at the moment, Nirvana, with educators is how one is able to address education at all levels, early childhood development through to the primary school years, and then of course the evolution into tertiary education. To put it into perspective, I interacted with a 9-year-old this week who has already jumped a grade. She's gone from grade 5 to grade 6 in the space of a year as a result of technology being an enabler. And so education remains the key, and it's how we're able to be able to address that. And so African solutions to African problems is what businesses need to get their heads around. So I've been talking to educators more recently who are developing online platforms, private level schooling with A levels and O levels admission to the Cambridge system, but accessibility to all. And so technology solutions again come to play here. And I think maybe just to make a broader comment, there's a question here around the fourth industrial revolution. Now, this is something our politicians love to quote. This is something folk love to speak about. But in fact, the fourth industrial revolution has been brought forward in leaps and bounds. What was initially on national and international radars of a 10 to 20 to 30 year planning horizon has in fact been brought forward in the matter of months. And so, to answer your question, Steve, the fourth industrial revolution is now here. And in fact, we now need to be bypassing that thinking and saying, well, deindustrialization is happening. Green economy is coming into the fore in a big way. Education is now broad-based and available. Borders in the longer term may or may not exist. So how do we break down those barriers? And in fact, part of that is what's happening to us at the moment. Then,
there's a question from Marianne. I don't know, Marianne, and then we're going to take Alex after that. So Marianne, I don't know if you want to just pose your question, or do you just want George to answer it off the screen? Either way, happy to do that.
Hi, yes. Morning, George. I had an opportunity to speak to a very senior professor, I forgot to put here, but he is in education at a local university yesterday. It was regarding a huge need that has been expressed by educators, teachers in the arts. And of course, the arts is one of the most, volatile things at the moment. They're threatened with losing their jobs because they don't have a PGCE. And the PGCE is on offer. There's only one online at the moment. It's fully subscribed for next year. they will lose their jobs if they are not registered for a PGCE within the next year, with a 3-year window given to them by SACE, the South African Council for Educators, for being registered. So I approached this university, I approached the professor, one of the most senior people there, with a view to setting this up. His response, I mean, I would have given the response within 30 minutes. As you said earlier, you've got to be able to respond within 30 minutes to these requests. He wants a market survey done to see whether there really is a need for this. When in fact students are graduating throughout the country with BMAS degrees, they have to do an extra year of a PGCE because the degree does not qualify them as a professional. They cannot move into education anymore at all. That would give them an extra year of education, whereas if they were enrolled for an online PGCE, they would be able to move into a job showing that they actually are enrolled for the PGCE online, and they'd save a whole year where they could be part of the economy. So what actually is happening is that the universities are not feeding into the need, not only of the existing teachers who need to cap their qualifications so that they don't lose their jobs, but they are also not looking at what the young people are needing to go into the employment sector. And why does it need somebody of 70 to tell them this?
Sure.
I mean, it just boggles the mind that people who are in the field and working and earning huge salaries for doing this have not got round to thinking.
It's an interesting question.
So to me, sorry, George, the idea is, I mean, I think the first line of attack here would probably be to speak to the academics, as you say you are doing at the moment, but just to highlight how absolutely essential that is.
It's an extraordinary, and thanks for that. That was a very insightful question there. I mean, the reality is, if we don't address our own questions, other universities will address them for us. You can do a Harvard qualification online in 3 months. It's now available. You can do the full qualification, and should you want to graduate, then you pay for the content you've learned. Oxford has made itself available. Cambridge is doing the same. The education barriers, or the entry levels or entry barriers, are being broken down daily. I'll give you a classic example. We're in the healthcare industry, and so we do a lot of training, and our accrediting body refused to accredit online training. Well, that was the going in position at the start of COVID. 5 weeks later, that position has changed. That's the world we're in, So thank you, Marianne. Maggie, you've asked a question around...
Can we quickly go to Alex? Sorry, he raised his hand. Alex raised his hand, so I just want to go to Alex.
Thank you. Thanks, George, for a great presentation. Firstly, George, as we know, the demographics of South Africa, with the Gini coefficient currently, South Africa is the second highest in the world after Lesotho, okay, standing at 62.5%. Now, coming to unemployment in this country, as we know, the poorest of poor have been, prior to COVID-19, have been very much affected with unemployment in the country, all over South Africa. And I take it maybe in other parts of the world as well. However, now with COVID-19, it has obviously will exacerbate unemployment. Then coming to the previous speak on education, I think because historically, South Africa as well, the poorest of poor never always had the opportunity for education. Now with new technologies, how is this education going to be made available to the poorest of poor? That's just my take on that, if I can get answers to that.
Thanks, Alex, and a great question. So again, talking to companies like IDEA, okay, which we've dealt with recently, they have developed a platform that they're currently piloting in Burundi and in Rwanda, okay, places like that, where data or good communication points are an issue. They've actually developed a very low data transferal rate of educated content. Africa prolifically is adopting smartphone technology, believe it or not. your entrance of lower products or lower spec products, but the ability to accept data content is there. And so you know, to answer you, I think the answer to bad governance and to bad education systems is now being answered by a virus. It's being brought forward, and methods of educating we're breaking down the barriers, much the same as I said to Marianne. And I think, Alex, there's a broader question here as well, and that is educating for a future workforce. What are we preparing people to do? You know, what are we educating them to do? What kind of education systems will be appropriate in the future? We don't have those answers. These are exploratory questions, but make no mistake, they're being answered fast and furiously. So thank you. And then
so now we're going to Maggie.
Go for it. Maggie? Hi, Maggie, you just need to unmute. Okay, so Maggie actually asks a question here on the chat box, and that is around real estate. And you know, what does that mean for real estate? So I'll give you an example. We had a board meeting an advisory board meeting with a large healthcare provider who have a big glossy building in Sandton that they've only just moved into. And what's going to happen to that? Because the workforce hasn't returned to it. You know, so what happens to property development companies, your growth points, etc. You know, who have made their livelihoods out of corporate rentals, and no doubt there'll be folk on the line today who are experiencing this very same challenge. I mentioned the Inner City for Johannesburg Partnership, who have taken 7 buildings and converted those into urban farms and residential complexes. Is that not where we're heading? And again, this virus has simply brought this all forward for us. Maggie, I don't know if I've answered your question entirely, but I see you there.
I think it's also... Okay.
Thank you, George. It makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Others are comments. No, I'm just saying the others are comments. I don't know if there's anybody who has a question specifically. The others are more comments on the conversation that we've been having. Nigel, I don't know if you want to say anything around your comment that you just made.
Yes, thank you. My concern is that COVID has enabled us to work in isolation from our offices, and my concern is largely about those who perform secretarial, receptionist, PA functions that we've discovered we can do without them. So what happens to them? And they are quite a large part of the unfortunate lower earning sectors. So is there an opportunity to upskill, and how do we deal with that? Because now we're almost widening that gap in terms of the Gini coefficient of the haves and have not, because they're becoming now redundant.
It's a great question, Nigel. And so if we let's look to Europe, look to the French as an example. They've went from a 5-day working week to a 4-day working week. And that was a conscious decision by the government, the French government, to make sure that there was a wider availability of working hours for the unemployed, and an opportunity to skill in the gap, so to speak. The reality for a country like ours, Nigel, is that we all have to be in a space where we are doing 2 or 3 different careers. We need to be upskilling for those careers, so be it in the professional services, be it in the consulting environment. And you rightly point out, I mean, there are some entry-level skills at an organization that years ago were fundamental to the working of that organization, which in the future will no longer be relevant. And I'm sorry if that answer sounds harsh, but it is a reality check for us. And it goes back to, what are we educating for? What kind of jobs are we building for the future? If I take my little 11-year-old niece, okay, so she's learning robotics. She's learning artificial intelligence. You know, she's navigating her way around a computer far more effectively than some of her peers. They shall remain nameless, okay, i.e. myself. You know, so that's the world we're moving into. What kind of world are we educating for?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to quickly just jump to William, where he's wanted to explore some more around urban farming.
Great.
So William, I don't know if you want to jump on the line, or if we can just. His question is, what does it entail, and how will that influence current sectors?
Well, if we go back to the comment that one of the speakers made in the first three reflections, localization. Okay, so local markets, local supply chain. Or even back to the very opening comment that 2008, prior to the financial crisis, will historically be seen as the peak of globalization. I think we're heading back into local conditions, local markets, local supply chain. So if you think of urban farming and the potential of urban farming and food security for cities, I think that's where we're heading to try and answer that for you, William. And I think we will find that we will reorganize ourselves into a whole new supply chain and a whole new method of achieving global growth and food security. Technology will be an enabling partner. For example, imagine on your app, within a 500-meter radius, you can find somebody who supplies tomatoes, okay, or somebody who supplies fresh carrots, or somebody who does baking. Think about the possibilities of local markets evolving into supply chain. You think of your Tambali food incubation projects in the north of this country, who are supplying the international community. And this is primarily a community of unemployed youngsters who were taught how to farm responsibly. On the rooftop of Eastgate is an aquaponics farm. Okay, that's where we're heading. That's the new world. Quite exciting and frightening at the same time.
Nirvana was asking a question. Do you think the move to the gig work culture is accelerated?
Do I think that the move to
gig work culture is being accelerated?
Definitely, without a doubt. Absolutely, without a doubt. If you just look at how we've all adapted in the space of a quarter, 3 months, that's all it's been. 120 days of lockdown so far? I guess so nearly 4 months. And look at how we've adapted to working. Look at this alumni meeting. This historically would have taken weeks and weeks of organizing, booking hotel, tea and coffee, you name it, arranging speakers. But here we've managed to get together a global community who, and I remind you, are represented from India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and I spotted somebody from England as well. That's where we've headed. Undoubtedly, this is all being sped up.
Herbie, I don't know if you want to just make your comment or
Hello,
ask
Herbie.
a question.
Thank you, everybody. I think just an objective comment in terms of generating results. If we can take the practical results from the LIS, from the lower income streams to the education system and show them the results, I think that's where we're going to try and generate a bit of movement. In terms of the financial and the communication implementation, that has to be e-com. It's the way of the future. And I think strategy in terms of that implementation is absolute key for future development.
Absolutely. Thanks, Herbie. That's a great observation. And I absolutely agree with you. Thank you.
Marianne, you've just made a comment on the urban farming. So I don't know if you want to raise your comment or your question.
I'm just wondering, the urban farming, yes, indeed, we're seeing more and more, my main business, I moved directly from the hospitality industry to making frozen food, frozen meals, which we sell only locally. And most of the products that we source are from local people. Now, what happens to these vast farms? What is going to happen to the farms that are, however many thousand hectares?
Absolutely. It's a great question, Marianne, and one that we need to reflect on. But potentially it answers part of this, our own local challenge as to, farming or access to farming for all. Are we moving now to a more gregarious society that is more conscious of the needs of all? I don't know, and I think that's a great question. And if, with your permission, I'm actually going to explore that in the coming week. Maybe we'll bring it into next week's conversation, if that's okay.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Zalani, I don't know if you made a few comments. I don't know if you want to raise anything or. No, it's not Zalani. It's somebody.
Sorry. You
I'm
weren't
not
talking.
able to. No, I wasn't. I'm
good.
speaking to one
Sorry,
of
I
the
got confused.
participants, and I unfortunately can't say your name. So, Mr. Martin, if you want to raise your comment or ask a question as we starting to getting to the end of the session, we don't want to go over the hour that's been booked.
Thanks. Just going back and looking at some of the questions as well. The question around future investments. So we all have traditionally worked towards when you retire, you need to have enough money to retire, and so where do you place your investments? Diversification, sustainability goals, development goals are going to be key. A very interesting paper is the United Nations sustainability goals and the evolution thereof, because that gives you a sense of where the planet is heading and what the thinking is. But I can say to you that certainly from investment portfolio reviews, and I'm not a great expert in this field, but diversification is the name of the game, and certainly looking at green goals, sustainability goals, and portfolios that invest themselves in that. Let's take South Africa as an example. British American Tobacco or the alcohol industry. What has happened to them? So if you had all your shares in alcohol and tobacco, what do you do now? Okay, and so investment houses need to be taking the long view of this, long-term view, and green goals is where it's at. Then I'm going to sort of intervene here just briefly. I want to ask a question of Sarah Campbell-Watts, who's on the line. Sarah, you're primarily in the change management industry. What are you seeing? What are your observations?
So I suppose, thanks so much. I'm really enjoying the conversation. What I'm seeing both here and from colleagues who in different parts of the world is that probably the call on change managers or people in that space to actually come in and offer input and advice is greater now than it has been ever, I think. There's a colleague of mine, Professor Julie Hodges, who's at Durham University. She heads up one of the MBA programs there. And she says she's never, her specialism is change, and she's written a number of books on it. And she says she's never had a greater call of people wanting like sessions like this and really understanding it. I think in the space of change, often change management or the people side of change is seen as the kind of the last little bit you tag on the end of a change piece because there's not enough money. It's usually the people bit is left to the end. And what we've seen is in organizations that have invested in that space, spent a lot of time actually working with change and how you equip leaders and teams to actually be agile. What we've observed is that those organizations in South Africa in particular are faring better than others, like remarkably so. So even in a space like tourism, which is under severe pressure, we've seen in hotels that have actually spent the time investing in that, they have been far faster to quickly, as you said, that 30-minute turnaround, almost being able to see and immediately work out how to turn around their business into a completely new business within weeks. And I think what I think is going to happen is the realization that actually investing in people and the development of these like core skills is actually at the heart of business rather than the add-on at the end. And those that do, I think particularly now, I've never seen a stronger case for those that have taken the time are faring better right now than those who've never looked into the space.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a great observation. And
there's a question from Evelyn before, George, if you want to just finish what you're talking, because I think it's a very good question before we start wrapping up.
Just to say to Sarah, I think it's absolutely fundamental that where we're heading in this new connectedness, we've got to find new ways to develop ourselves and develop people, and our workforce, who will not be visible, but will be working behind the scenes, need to be emotionally engaged, emotionally invested in our businesses. And so it is all about people. So thank you. That was a great observation. Sorry, Verna, back to you.
So Evelyn was asking a question about policy and implementation in South Africa, in a South African context. So how will this all impact policy formulation in a South African context?
And Evelyn, thank you. That's a great question. So a very interesting shift is happening. And if we take COVID and our response to COVID and how quickly we had to respond to new ways of working, that was people-centric, keeping people safe, but still balancing the economic imperative to keep an organization alive. That kind of policy formulation was happening at a pace that we've never seen before. New economic policy formation is happening faster than we can possibly imagine. So I think what we've moved into is an elevated pace. Now we need to be saying, at a global context and a local context, what is responsible policy formulation? Present government, and I'll declare my colours up front, I don't think the way some of the regulations been promulgated has always considered responsibly the impact on people. And so policy formulation is now very visible, and the ability to challenge this publicly and the ability to debate it publicly has been exponentially grown, so to speak. So it's an interesting space to be in, and the crystal ball is not that clear at the moment. Okay, it's murky.
George, I want to ask a question on policy formulation. I was listening to a talk recently that spoke about how policymakers have often neglected females from the table around the discussion, and the impact that this has in the current environment is in my view, is quite severe. If you think of the fact that a lot of females are mainly impacted globally by the pandemic because of the types of work that we do, the fact that we now have to look after kids, plus try and juggle work. Do we think that we have enough females sitting on these politics forums to inform some of the social types of impact that the policies that we will be making going forward will have?
I think the short answer is no, we don't. But I think what we're seeing is evolution to more gender parity, diversity awareness. So even our narrative has changed globally and locally. The way we talk about these things. Gender-based violence, a huge topic for us, and what does that mean? Where do we head? In that space. So, with your permission, I'm gonna pick this up again next week. I think it's a great topic. Thank you for raising that question.
Guys, we've got 3 minutes left. So I don't know if there's anybody who has a question, can pop it or raise their hand. Let's take it from there. If there's any questions and you want to maybe send it to Christelle as well, would be awesome. And George, and some of us will pick it up next week or in the course of the next 3 weeks. I just want to say, as closing, to everyone, thank you very much for joining us. It's been an honor, George. Thank you again for making yourself available and your time for doing this, and the team behind the scenes, Christelle and the USB, for making this possible at such short notice, because we really had to turn around this one quite quickly. I think in closing for me, as we just navigate the change that this pandemic has hurtled us into, we've obviously need to look at some of the lessons that not only ourselves, but our businesses can take on board. And we've looked at 7 of those lessons. And I think as we go through the next 3 weeks, we will unpack some of the other lessons out of the 21 that we feel is quite relevant. So I just want to say, please join us. The link that was in the chat will allow you to join the entire series, and not only this series, but also any of the USB alumni events, which will be really, really great to get your insights and keep the conversation going forward. So thank you very much from the Gauteng chapter, and hope that you guys can join us over the next few weeks. George, anything else you want to add?
Thank you. It was just great to be able to explore this topic with you. And thanks again to all our visitors from abroad, India, Australia, New Zealand, England. You're most welcome. And of course, to our local crowd, very welcome always.
Okay. Thanks, George.
Take care.
Okay. Bye.